Hey folks, before this video gets underway, I just wanted to quickly jump in. I'm actually recording this quite a few days later because it dawned on me that some people watching this review or video, as you'll hear my description later, some people may not have seen the Curious Evolved USB cable review, and that's where I talked about a lot of the theory around USB cables. Bear with me for just a minute while I talk about the theory that underpins what I'm about to talk about. When transmitting digital audio via, in this case, a USB cable, there are some people out there that believe the audio signal cannot be interrupted by anything along the signal path. What I mean by that is that whatever's spat out of the PC USB socket in this case is perfectly translated to what the DAC receives at the other end. The theory being that there's error checking along the way and that it's all just ones and zeros. Now in my Curious Evolved USB cable review, I spoke about the fact that there are other people out there who believe that USB cables can alter the end result of the signal. And that can come in the form of changes to the way the voltages are swung up and down to represent those ones and zeros, potentially RF noise being introduced, and the fact that there is potentially not the same error checking that goes on with, say, a normal data transfer to a hard drive or a printer in the case of audio, because audio is very time specific. So what this video is about is very much trying to check if the signal that comes through a USB cable for audio is actually identical regardless of the cable being used, when it's being recorded, how it's being recorded, any factors at all. The theory that there is digital error correction and also that it's just ones and zeros means that it shouldn't matter what cable you plug in, as long as it meets specifications, what comes out the other end should always be identical. So that's the basis for this video. I'll now jump out of the way and let the full version play, but I just wanted to make sure that I provided the right foundational info before the rest of this video plays. So sit back, enjoy, and I look forward to the comments down below. Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, and welcome to another video here on Passion for Sound. I'm specifically not calling this an audio review because even though I'm going to talk about multiple USB cables, there's a lot more going on in this video than a review of the cables themselves. And although I may at the end of it tell you which of the cables I prefer, it's not so much about reviewing the cables as it is to start some further discussion on USB cables. If you're a regular viewer of the channel, you'll have seen that I did a review some time ago on the Curious Evolved USB cable. That's an expensive premium cable which I found to be very effective at doing what it claimed to do, but it definitely sparked a lot of debate. And so this video is looking more at budget USB cables in the sort of $30 to $40 range, things that are very affordable but may or may not offer an upgrade from the stock generic printer style cable. So what I have in front of me here is a range of cables that are all a part of this test. And I'm calling it a test because, as you'll see shortly, I've done this somewhat scientifically, and I'll get into that in a moment. But just to take you through the cables we're looking at, I've started off with just a really generic standard style USB cable. This is like a printer cable. I don't know the device it came from, but it meets standard specs, etc. It's just a generic cable. What I then threw into the mix was, as a reference point, the AudioQuest Diamond. This is a crazy expensive $1,000 odd US cable. I included the Wireworld USB cable. I included the Oyaide Neo Plus USB cable, and finally the Supra USB cable. So as I said, all of these are pretty affordable except for the Diamond, but we'll get to that later. They're all cables that I've had people say on the channel that they really like, that they find affordable, effective, etc. And so I was keen to test them out and do two things. First of all, see if I could hear a difference between them, but second of all, see if I could prove a difference or no difference between them in a more scientific way than just listening tests. So what I'm going to do is not talk about what I've heard. I'm going to jump over to the computer and talk about what I could prove in terms of whether there were or were not differences. And I'll talk you through the process, knowing that it is potentially still somewhat flawed, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but hopefully a more scientific approach to comparing the sound of USB cables. Now bear with me, if you're a USB cable non-believer, please bear with me, watch this video and see what you think, and feel free to comment down below as to what I'm about to talk about. I'm very open to this being more of a conversation starter and something that might pose further questions more so than solutions and definitive answers. Now before I get into it, I do want to remind you that the giveaway for the UP4 and the UA1 from Shanling is currently not yet drawn. So if you do want to get into that and have the chance to win either the UA1 and or the UP4, you could be lucky and win both. All you need to do is go and watch the Jotunheim 2 video and also the UA1 video. I'll put links down below, so make sure you go check those out if you'd like to win. But for now, I'm going to switch over to my webcam so I can show you what's going on my computer, explain the testing that I've done, and hopefully start some conversation around USB cables for audio. I should mention the sound's going to drop off a bit in terms of quality because I need to be using my recording software to actually do the comparison of the audio. So I'm going to be using my webcam both for video and for audio for this next bit. Apologies for the drop in quality, but hopefully you'll enjoy the content. Okay, so welcome now into Audacity. This is the audio software I've used for this test, and I want to start off by explaining what I've got here on screen and how I came to get them. So what you can see here on screen is a whole range of different audio recordings, all using the exact same wave lossless audio file. It's a track that I downloaded from Epidemic Sounds, which I use for all of my videos. And by the way, there's no ad in there, I'm just letting you know where the source was for the music. I needed to use royalty-free tracks for this so I can play it back without any copyright issues on this video. So that's where I got it from, and that's what type of track it is. In other words, a lossless track for the best possible sound quality. And how I recorded these was I was running my laptop as the source with the file stored on the solid-state drive of the laptop. I then sent the audio from the laptop through the various USB cables in question and sent it through to the Chord Hugo TT2. Now I wasn't using the M scaler for this test, it was just the TT2 doing the processing, and then that was output via XLR into the Focusrite Scarlett 2i2 audio interface, and from there recorded to the files you see here. These were all recorded at 44.1 kHz 16-bit quality. So now let me talk you through what we can see on screen. Up here in the left-hand side of each bar of sound, you can see we've got the type of cable I was using. Now, some of you might be saying this should have been done blind, etc., etc. For what I'm about to do, blind has nothing to do with it because it all comes down to the scientific or semi-scientific, I'm going to call it, comparison of the waveforms themselves. And I'll explain exactly how I've made sure these are identical waveforms in just a moment, but let me talk you through what we've got. So I've got the generic cable here, that's the generic printer cable. I've then got an inverted version of that same file. I've got the diamond cable, the diamond inverted, the Oyaide cable, the Oyaide inverted. Now this is coloured because it's currently unmuted, that's why it's showing up and the others are grey. I've then got the Supra cable and the Supra 2, which I'll talk about shortly, and then the Supra inverted. Finally the Wireworld and the Wireworld inverted. So what you can see here is that each file has the standard recording plus an inverted copy of the recording, and I'll explain to you shortly why that is. If I roll up to the top though first, I want to explain how I made sure all of these files were exactly identical, because what I'm about to do is play one copy of a file against an inverted copy of the other. Because in theory, if you take two identical waveforms, invert one of them that is, and play them back, you will get no sound at all. And I'll show you how that works in just a moment. So my theory was, if I was to record audio played back through one USB cable and compare it to identical audio played back through a different USB cable, if they are exactly the same signal coming through, which digital theory and people on the channel have said should be the case, then we should get silence. So that was the way I thought I'd test this once and for all and see what I found. Now, what I want to point out first and foremost is that because I was recording, there was a chance that there were going to be minor variations in the exact start time of the recordings. I was using the automatic stop and start function within Audacity, but I did find it was a little bit inaccurate. So what I actually did to make sure I got this exactly right for all recordings was I've zoomed in, and I'll show you on screen in a second, the exact cut that I made for every single one. I zoomed all the way in, and I'll show you here on screen. And you can see here, these are the individual samples. So what I did was I found a very obvious shape in the waveform at a very obvious point in the waveform. I zoomed all the way in, and I've cut every single one of these recordings at exactly the same sample. So I'm not just saying somewhere in the waveform at the time, this is down to the exact sample I've cut them. And so in theory, if digital is digital and everything's coming through the same, what we'll get is perfectly aligned audio waveforms that will then cancel each other out. Now I'm going to put on my headphones so I can hear what you're hearing and talk about it in just a second, but now let's go through and I'll talk you through the results. So I'm going to start off by playing you the waveform completely unadjusted straight from the generic cable. Okay, so that should give you a sense of the track that I've chosen. There's nothing special about the track. It didn't matter how high quality it was. It was just about having a piece of audio that I could work with that I knew was lossless to start with. So the first step in my process was to prove that my theory worked. In other words, if I invert the waveform and play it against itself, do we get zero sound? Now I want to point out that you can watch when I'm playing back, and you can see up the top here, you can see the playback levels. This is the audio output from the software. If I stop this now, I'm going to unmute the generic inversion. So in other words, this is the exact same waveform as up here. I'm just going to remove one side so I can hear myself better. This is going to take the exact waveform up here, flip it on itself and play it back. Now if I zoom right in, you'll actually see how the inversion works. Okay, so notice here, if we look at the blue waveform first, this is dipping below the center line, and this is for the left and the right channels. This is dipping below the center line here. If you look at the waveform below, the red one, which is inverted, it's coming above the center line. So it's exactly the same file, just flipped 180 degrees. And so if I play them back now, these are the only two active. I'm just going to scroll down so you can see everything else is grey, like so. So if I play this back, we're going to hear what happens when you put identical waveforms, one positive, one negative. Now you can hear absolutely nothing in terms of music, and if you have a look at the output bars up here, you can see there is no signal coming out whatsoever. So what this tells us is if we have two identical files, one of them inverted, and we play them back, we will get no output. They will cancel each other out. So the theory now was that I could take the generic recording and play it against the inverted version from one of the other USB cables, and we should get absolutely no sound, because the theory says USB cables make no difference. So let's have a look at that now. What I'm going to do first and foremost is I'm going to put the generic sound up against the diamond without inverting it. So now we're playing two copies of the same file, and the reason I want to play that to you is to prove that they are perfectly aligned. Okay, so this is now playing both of them back, and as you can hear, there's no echoes, there's no significant flanging of the audio, they are both aligned. I would give up all my money, I would trade all of my gold. So I'll turn the diamond off, the level drops because we've taken away half the signal. Switch it on, it just gets louder. So notice that they are perfectly aligned audio signals. I'm now going to mute diamond, and now I'm going to turn on the diamond inverted. So what we're about to have is the diamond inverted playing next to the non-inverted generic recording from the stock printer cable. And notice what happens. We've cut away a huge amount of the audio, but there is still some there. And notably, you can see up the top here, we've got audio levels that are sitting around about -30, somewhere in that -30 to -24 decibel range. So it's a huge drop in audio level, but there's still sound coming through. I'm going to shut up for a minute so you can hear it a little bit. So that was the end of the track when it dropped out there, but what you hopefully have noticed is that this signal coming from the diamond USB cable is not the same as the signal coming from the generic cable. So let's step through some others and we'll see what we hear. And what I might do is I'm going to start by playing again the diamond inverted with the generic, and then I'm going to step through various other versions, all of them inverted. So we're going to keep the standard generic recording, and we're just going to try it against all of the different USB cables, but with their signals inverted. What I want you to pay attention to is the difference in the sounds that we get depending on which cable. Starting with diamond. Back to just generic. And now adding the Oyaide inverted. Now I'm going to mute the Oyaide, and we're going to go to the Supra inverted. Now we'll turn off the Supra inverted, go to the Wireworld inverted. So notice straight away when we've gone to the Wireworld inverted, the signal level is much higher. So that means the Wireworld inverted for some reason is more different from the generic cable recording than the Supra inverted. So notice now if I compare the Supra inverted and the generic comparison with the Wireworld inverted and generic comparison, we're getting quite different output levels. So we'll start again with the Supra inverted and the generic standard output. Okay, so take note of where our levels are. We're sitting at around about that -24 mark. I'm going to turn off Supra inverted, turn on Wireworld inverted. And notice straight away it's punching up above -24. You can also hear that it's quieter, it's a different tonality. I'll jump between the two. That's quieter than the Wireworld. Back to Supra. Notice it's louder. So what this is telling us is that we have different signals coming out depending on which cable we use. So what that says to me is that these USB cables are somehow transmitting the signal differently. Now I did have one big question, which is, could this somehow be an issue with the recording itself, the process I've used? So what I did was I re-recorded using the Supra cable just by random selection. It didn't matter which cable I used. But what I wanted to do was try a new recording of one of the same cables and compare those two files with each other. So that's why I've got this Supra 2 recording here. So Supra 1, or the Supra base one here at the top, this one here, this was recorded and then inverted to create Supra inverted. This Supra 2 recording was completed in an entirely different instance, in fact the next day, when I suddenly thought I need to compare two recordings with the same cable and see if we have the same issue. So let me play you now the Supra 2 recording, which is in its normal phase. So I'm going to solo that to bring it on, and then I'm going to unmute Supra inverted, so we've got the original Supra recording inverted against Supra 2 in its standard setup. And I want you to notice just how low the volume levels are. Surprisingly, there is still a tiny bit of audio coming through, but it's very, very minimal. So what that says to me is that there is some degree of variation from one playback to another. That says to us the digital playback process using USB is not perfect. Anyone who tells you that it is absolutely bit accurate every single time you play it back because it's digital, it's flat out wrong. This is proving to us once and for all that with two perfectly matched files that line up exactly in terms of timing, we're still getting some sort of variation. What it also shows though is the fact that the Supra cable produces more consistent results with itself than it produces when compared to other cables. So in other words, there seems to be a consistency in terms of how the Supra transmits the signal. That means it is closer to the exact same output each time than, say, looking at the Supra versus the Wireworld. So this really got me thinking, and as I said, I'm not going to draw any fine conclusions here. All I wanted to point out was the fact that I believe there is more going on here than we necessarily understand when someone tells us that digital is digital and there's no variation caused. This test has proved to me that different cables have obviously created different audio outputs. I'm not going to try once again to get into how they're doing it, why they're doing it, what exactly is going on, because having done that in the Curious Evolved USB cable review, having put forward what I thought some theories might have been, I've since had further discussions with people and I'm now questioning my initial theories and wondering if there's something else going on. But I don't know what that is, so I'm not going to speculate. All I'm going to say is that something is going on because these files should absolutely line up with one another. They're cut to the exact sample with one another. They're exactly the same file, played back through the exact same source chain with no changes to volume. So with everything else being identical and the only thing varying being the USB cable, there's no explanation other than the fact of two things. One of them is that the USB cables are transmitting those signals differently somehow, and that is somehow able to influence the output, and or that there are variations between one playback and the next because the audio system is not doing error correction in the way that some people seem to think that it is. If error correction was being done properly, we would not be having this issue. So to finish things off, what I'd like to do is just quickly run through, and I want to compare the sound differences, not just with the generic versus the aftermarket cables, but with the various aftermarket cables against one another, just to show the sort of range of variation we're actually hearing. So I'm going to start now by muting Supra inverted and Supra 2. And what we're going to do is we're going to step through, just make sure nothing else is on. I'm going to start us off with the diamond USB cable. And now let's compare it with the Oyaide cable inverted. And now the Supra cable inverted. So hopefully what you're noticing there is there's a different tonality to what's left behind. Now we're going to switch that off and go to the Wireworld. Notice there's a slightly fuller sound there, there's a little bit more getting through it seems in the mid-range or something. I'll go back to the Supra inverted so you can compare. And then I'll go back to the Oyaide inverted. So hopefully you're hearing what I heard, which is that each of the different cables is providing a slightly different version of that audio waveform. As I said, I'm not going to get into why that is. All I can do is present the evidence, and I'd love to hear people's comments down below. If you think there's a method issue in terms of how I've done it, let me know that. If you think there's more going on, please add that to the comments. If you think this is just blowing your mind a bit like it did mine, then put that down there as well. I'd like to start a conversation. One thing I'm going to ask though is please be respectful in the conversation. This is intended to be an exploration of this, and I am not intending this to be in any way causing problems or issues or arguments. It's just an exploration in a way that I hope is somewhat more scientific and will help us to understand USB audio better. With all that said, I'm going to go back over to the main camera and talk about which of the cables I personally preferred having done this testing. Hopefully seeing that has opened up your mind to the fact that USB cables might not be as clear-cut and straightforward as some people think. When I got these cables, I was planning on listening to them, drawing some subjective conclusions, and sharing my thoughts on which ones sounded better than others. Part of the problem I had was that when I listened to them, it was really hard to separate them. And so that's where I started down the path of recording. That triggered me to then think about maybe comparing the recordings with one another, and so it led to what you've just seen. So I do want to close this out though by talking about which of the cables I preferred when considering the three well-priced aftermarket cables, being the Oyaide, that's the Wireworld, the Oyaide, the black and the orange, and also the Supra cable. In terms of sound, what I found as I listened to the recordings, and originally I did set it up with blind recordings, I didn't know which one was which in my recordings. I had the naming done separately so that I couldn't tell which was which. They were actually called things like chair, bench and table because I wanted generic names that meant nothing and had no bias attached. So as I listened to them, I was listening to them blind. I had no idea which I was hearing, and whilst I found them difficult to separate, one of the cables consistently to me had a slightly better sense of body and warmth to the sound. And that one for me was the Supra cable, once I actually worked out which cable was which. So when I went back and actually found out how they'd been named and which cable was which, it was the Supra cable that I tended to prefer. Now, I think all three cables are fine, but for some reason the Supra is doing a better job to me at, I think, getting rid of external noise, so RF noise and the like. And the reason I say that I think that's what's going on is that when I've done various other testing in recent times, when I've done some researching and talking to experts in the field, like say Rob Watts from Chord Electronics, one of the common things that comes up is that RF noise produces a sense of brightness in the sound when it gets into our systems, and it can also mask things because of that extra brightness, that extra noise in the sound. It can mask things like spatial detail. And so what I found was that when I was listening to what turned out to be the Oyaide and the Wireworld cables, I was hearing a little bit less sense of space. It was more flat and two-dimensional, and certainly seemed a bit brighter, which may come across to some people as more detailed at first, but I believe it's actually an artificial sense of detail from a bit of extra noise getting in. If I had to split between the Wireworld and the Oyaide, I think I'd prefer the Oyaide ever so slightly, because I think the Wireworld was probably the harshest sounding of the three. That said, it was extremely hard to separate all three of them, and that's why I did the testing that I've just shown you, was to try to find a different way to work out what was going on. Now, I never got to the point with my testing of scientifically proving which was correct and which was incorrect, because I have no way of knowing what the correct sound should be. I could take the WAV file of the music, run it in Audacity, cut it the same way, but it's not going to take into account the fact that it's still having to be passed through to test the USB cables, being passed through the TT2, through XLR cables, into the Scarlett 2i2. All of those things are going to add different bits and pieces potentially to the end output. So without somehow being able to get a pristine version through that same source chain and into the system, I can't really test to say which one is true or correct. With that in mind, I can only tell you which I think is the better cable, and ultimately it's the Supra that I found myself enjoying listening to. And for the same reasons as I liked the Curious Evolved cable when I tried that one out. It's smoother, it's richer, and it has less sense of that little bit of hash or brightness that seems to come from RF noise. I personally think all three cables are a nice choice. They're well made. If you're just looking for something that looks and feels better than a standard generic cable, I think you couldn't go too far wrong with any of these three. But I do want to point out that from memory, and I didn't even look at pricing on this because I didn't want that to influence things, I think though the Supra might be a touch more expensive. That also just could be that they're not sold here in Australia, so it was a bit harder for me to get. Interestingly, one thing I did find in this testing was that I actually preferred the sound of the Supra to the very, very expensive AudioQuest Diamond cable. I've reviewed every single one of AudioQuest's USB cables once upon a time in my written blog, and what I found was that as I went up through the range, every single cable did make a difference, did make a noticeable difference, but as I got higher up, what I found was I actually didn't like the AudioQuest Diamond as much as I liked the next level down, AudioQuest Coffee. For me, the Supra cable is also superior sonically to my tastes than the AudioQuest Diamond. And that therefore says to me, this is not a question of preferring whatever's more expensive, because on 2 occasions now, in fact 3 occasions if you include the Curious Evolved USB review, on 3 occasions now I have preferred a less expensive cable, because ultimately for me it's about how it sounds, not how it looks or how much it costs. There's no doubt in my mind that there is a sense of enjoyment in a cable that you maybe prefer the look of. You know, out of these 3, I probably prefer the look and the feel the most of the Oyaide cable. I think it looks fantastic, it feels high quality, and it's the one I personally prefer interacting with more, but at the same time, the Supra does sound a bit better to my ears. I also think it still looks and feels very well made and of very high quality, and I do think that adds something to the overall experience, but hopefully is not the only thing influencing the perception of sound, which the tests here that I've just shown you do tend to back up by suggesting that there are sonic differences at play. This is a complex topic, and I'm not trying to end the conversation here or say that the Supra is the best of the 3 definitively or scientifically or in any kind of fully objective way. What I'm saying is I personally preferred the sound of the Supra because it was a little bit more smooth and had a slightly greater sense of depth in the sound. Beyond that though, what I wanted to do was show that it seems to me that USB cables are not a clear-cut case of digital is digital. There is more going on. I don't fully understand what that is yet. It might be RF noise, it might be variations in the voltages through the cable and the influences that's having on the DAC and the way it's decoding the audio. I'm not entirely sure. All I know is this suggests there's something going on, and let's start the discussion here. See what people think, see what you can add to the conversation, whether it be questions, ideas, suggestions, knowledge if you're in the industry, whatever you'd like to put forward. Let's have the conversation, let's keep it open and respectful and see what we can all learn. So for now, I'll invite you to check the comments, see what the conversation looks like, throw in your 5 cents worth, and together we'll explore the topic of USB cables further. For now though, just a reminder about those giveaways, the details being on both the Shit Jotunheim 2 and the Shanling UA1 reviews. Go over, check those out, put the codes in the comments to get yourself in the draw. Good luck with it, and in the meantime, happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.